This is the Roy's Boys Podcast with your host, Joshua Marlowe. Hey everybody, welcome to another edition of the Roy's Boys Podcast, powered by Carolina Electrical Services. For all your electrical needs, call Jacob Marlowe at 704-320-7357, and he'll make sure to take care of those needs for you right away. Josh and Anthony here with you as always, and today we're going to look at Kenny Williams' struggling 2018-19 season for the senior guard from Virginia. Kenny just never really had the type of senior year he wanted to have and what we wanted him to have as fans. And it was just something from the beginning. If you remember, Anthony, the first two games he scored 1 point. And we were all kind of thinking this isn't a big deal, but maybe that was kind of foreshadowing what was going to be a very long senior year for the guard.
Well, I think you have to kind of look at Kenny Williams in two different aspects. When you look at him as an offensive player, he really struggled. He had a tough year. There's no denying that. He was very far from the best player on the floor at Carolina this year. When you go to the defensive side, I mean, we were the guys that thought he probably should have been in the voting very solidly for ACC Defensive Player of the Year. He had a phenomenal senior year defensively. There were some times where he was out of position, but this was the year that I thought he was the most aggressive defensively when it came to taking charges. And a couple of those charges really did change some games. He had some really big moments for the Tar Heels. I think when people talk about Kenny Williams, they'll always remember a guy that in high school was talked about as a great shooter, was a guy that was expected to come in and be really, really good shooting the basketball at Carolina, but really wasn't that, but was also a really, really good defender. That, you know, without him, I mean, you wonder, especially this year and early on in the season, where would the Tar Heels have been without him on the roster? Because the defense was very far from a good unit early in the year. Now, they rounded themselves back into a good defensive team efficiency-wise, but a big part of that is because of what Kenny Williams did.
Yeah, defensively, not a whole lot of complaints from me on that front. There were some times he overplayed the ball and got kind of out of position, but we knew if we needed him to take a charge, he'd stand in there no matter the body. Whether it was a 6'8", 6'10" guy, he was going to sacrifice his body. I remember there was one time during the broadcast I was radioing during the season where Jones was just like, he's just physically beat up, and a lot was because he was willing to throw his body around. And so for us as fans, what do we love seeing guys get on the floor for loose balls, and that was Kenny Williams. I think it's kind of funny that this team won 33 games, or 29 games, won the ACC, or tied for the ACC regular season, with a guy that averaged less than 10 points a game, and going into the year you thought was probably going to have to give you double-digit scoring. That just kind of shows you really the coaching job that Roy Williams did this year, and the growth of Kobe White as the season matured, because he just wasn't the shooter that we expected him to be. I think we all thought, if you remember the Duke game 2 years ago in the Smith Center where he hit 6 threes, I think that was kind of, okay, this is what we're kind of expect from him more often. Not necessarily the 6 threes, but him being big in big games, which he kind of was for this team at some point. At NC State, he scored 15 on the road, which at the time was a really big win. At home against State, he gave you 17. And then against Duke on his senior night, he scored 18. So against his rivals, he kind of showed up to play ball.
Well, that first game against NC State, he hit a really big shot as well that pretty much sealed the game for Carolina. So you talk about a guy that when it came to playing in clutch time, yeah, he had his moments where he would step up and play really well. But I just think that by a certain point in the year, he kind of realized that I don't have to be this great scorer because we've got all these other guys around me that are getting the job done. And that was exactly what I think Roy Williams was hoping to get to. He didn't know if he would be able to get to that because two of the main guys that were part of the rotation were freshmen. But those guys stepped up. Luckily, for Kenny, it kind of offset some of his struggle scoring. But, I don't really know what to kind of take away from his struggles, scoring wise. It was kind of there throughout his career. I mean, he had his moments where he stepped up and played really well, but for the most part, he was never really that guy that was able to take over games on the offensive end. It's very similar to what we've seen from Andrew Platek, a guy that came in that was talked about as a really good shooter from beyond the arc, and so far we just haven't really seen it. But has established a different role. Platek has established a different role, not on the same level as Kenny just yet. Kenny became that guy that you would bring him in, when you needed to get energy back into the game if he was on the sideline. And of course, he was the guy that down the stretch, you needed in the game because he was your best defender. There was no denying that. I think each of the last 2 years, he was the best defender on the floor. So, and you talked about an effort guy. One of the other things that I really liked about him and that I think a lot of people should remember about his senior season is remember after that Louisville game, they challenged somebody to step up as the leader, the vocal leader on the floor. Kenny Williams was the guy that stepped into that role as a senior because Luke May is just not, that's not how Luke May is. That's not how any of the May family is. They're very quiet. They go about their business. They do what they have to do. Cam Johnson, I just don't feel like that's Cam either. But even if it was, I do feel like Cam kind of thought in his own mind, I wasn't here from the beginning. I wasn't a guy that was on the national championship squad. So I think Kenny really said to himself, look, I've got to be that guy that steps up and takes over this leadership role. And I thought he did just that this year after that Louisville game. So I got to hand it to him. That's one of the other things that a lot of people should remember about Kenny Williams' senior year and really thank him for stepping into that leadership role that really put Carolina in the position to finish tied for the ACC championship game, or ACC championship in the regular season.
Yeah, you literally took the words out of my mouth because I was going to bring that point up because you and I sat here after that Louisville loss and challenged him,
right?
As fans and as a podcaster of the program, it was you've got to be better. Whether it's you scoring the ball, whether it's you being better defensively, because before then he was our best defender, but it wasn't saying a whole lot because we weren't defending anybody. But
that is true.
After that, you kind of saw the better version of Kenny Williams defensively and really saw the team grow as a unit on that end of the floor because of his leadership, because of his vocal skills. And look, it's not easy being a leader. That's why it's very rare you get him. He didn't have to lead his first 3 years because you had either Marcus Page or Joel Berry doing that for you. Mm-hmm. And that was why, as when we entered the season, we didn't know who the leader was because that's not Luke. Cam was coming back for just his second year, so and we knew Kobe wasn't going to lead from day one. I think he eventually grew into the voice of that team as we got into March, but we needed Kenny to be the leader in November. He wasn't, but you get your butt embarrassed at home against Louisville. Mm-hmm. Perfect time to step up to the plate, and he did just that. But it's just he's one of those guys that, like, as a fan, he got a lot of crap on Twitter. We would see every game, but like I don't think we ever really knew how important he was until he just wouldn't, when he'd go missing, because when he disappeared on offense, or even when he was bad defensively, this team just really struggled. And I think that's something the fan base just kind of overlooked was he's not a great player because of his talent level, but his work ethic made him the player that he was, and we wouldn't have won 29 games without him.
I think that defensively, he's going to be a lot like Theo Pinson, where in the offseason, we're going to be talking about guys like Christian Keeling and potentially Leaky Black maybe playing a little bit of the two. You're not going to realize how much you miss him on the defensive end until you step on that floor and you play a few games without him. And then you realize we don't have that aggressive defender that does a great job of protecting us when it comes to some of these teams that can shoot really well from behind the arc. We don't have that guy that can take charges. Look at the guys that he was matched up against at times this year. First game of the year, he was matched up against the greatest player to ever play the game of basketball, apparently, in Fletcher McGee, because we heard about him for 2 weeks before we played that game, and he shut him down. Played against R.J. Barrett. I thought both times that he saw Barrett, he played very well. NC State played against Markel Johnson. Thought he did a really good job against him in the limited action that Johnson saw against him due to injury. So you look at some of the big guys that he played against, and you can say that some of the guys at times, they were matched up against guys that they should be able to overpower. Okay, but Kenny Williams was matched up with, in a lot of cases, the best player on the floor. There were a lot of good guards that this team faced this year. And I thought he did a really good job. You can say whatever you want about the final game of the year against Auburn. Nobody played good defensively. There's no way that you're just going to point to Kenny in that game and say he was the one that struggled. But I think when you go back into play next year, especially when you get into conference play, I think you're going to realize, man, Kenny Williams was a really good player, man. He was a key part. It's tough not having him on this on the defensive side of the basketball.
Yeah, you make a good point. He's probably the first guy we've had, probably since Danny Green, that no matter the way the lineup was written out, would draw the toughest assignment to defend because he was just that good of a defender. Like Marcus Page as a point guard was a really good defender, but he is not going to go guard a shooting guard or other small forward where we could do that with Kenny because you had lineup flexibility. And just really great point by you because, like you said, he drew Barrett 3 times. And even though Barrett got good numbers, Barrett had to work to get those numbers.
Most of the games, we don't have the sheet in front of us, but I'm willing to bet that every single one of those games, Barrett had to take at least 20 shots. I would guess over 25 in all 3 of those games, if I'm correct. Yeah, in order to get his points. It wasn't like, oh, he's just out there, knocking stuff down. He had some moments where he was knocking stuff down, but for the most part, Kenny Williams was phenomenal against him.
And it's not going to take this team long to miss him because they opened the season against an ACC opponent in Notre Dame. So we're going to miss him right then just because Notre Dame's a different team that you got to play against. Right. And you've got to be smart defensively because of their floor spacing, and they're really smart. Their basketball IQ is really high, so it's not going to take us very long to miss him on the defensive end. It's just I thought all year long, and I mentioned it, he might be Marcus Page, where it just as the season turns, he'll get better and better shooting the ball. It just never happened for him. You would have liked to think if he would have been a better player offensively, does that Auburn game maybe go different because you could run some offense through him instead of because Cam was sick,
I don't really know.
Sick, but it wasn't meant to be. This is a guy that gave it his all. He is a Tar Heel, even though he didn't originally commit here. So we're thankful for Shaka Smart leaving at VCU to go to Texas. That opened the venue for Kenny to come to Carolina, and kind of like Luke May, really reached his potential as a collegiate player because the talent level wasn't as high as his production at times his junior, senior year was. So let's thank Kenny for a fun 4 years. It was hard telling him goodbye. Right now he's competing in the pro basketball combine, trying to make a way as a professional basketball player. So we wish him the best of luck. Is there anything else you want to mention on his senior year before we get to recruiting really quick?
Well, I know that he did win the Marvin Williams Carolina Way Award this past year. So he is recognized by the program for winning an award. So this is a guy that did make an impact. I feel like a lot of people will kind of say, well, how much of an impact did Kenny Williams really make? He was a guy that, like you mentioned, especially this past year, he was highly criticized on social media at times. People really thought he would, step things up as the season went along, and when he didn't, they were very critical of him. But, I think it shows that he did have an impact, and for, us guys that are, watching the game a little more in depth, we know that, especially on the defensive end, he was just a phenomenal player. So he'll be missed. You mentioned it. Start the year with Notre Dame, and the battle for Atlantis is going to be pretty close after that. You're going to learn pretty quickly that not having a really good defender like Kenny Williams on the floor, it's not easy to just look past that. So we'll see. It's going to be a fun start to the year for sure, and we'll have those moments where we'll probably be on here or at least on the phone when we're watching games or talking after games. Talking about how, man, we miss Kenny Williams.
Yeah, it's going to happen with all 3 of those seniors that we lost. And those are the first 3 guys. We'll recap their season because they've left the program. Mm-hmm. And you talk about leaving an impact. All 3 guys that have graduated, they graduated a couple weeks ago, they left their mark on Carolina basketball one way or another. So with that, we'll move on to recruiting. And just a couple of nuggets that came on the recruiting front in the last week. Carolina offered Cam Johnson's little brother, Donovan Puff Johnson, a 4-star shooting guard this past week. This is a guy that I'm seeing him on Twitter all the time now with his mixtape, because he's one of those recruits that, like, has been really good, but now he's starting to really blow up on the national scene as an AAU guy. You would kind of think with the relationship that Roy has with Cam and his family, really the whole basketball office in terms of getting Cam from Pitt to Carolina, has that family. We'd have the inside to get his recruitment. Of course, he's got a long way to go because he's a 2020 kid, but we did offer him. And Jalen Wilson, if y'all, the guy that asked for his releasement from Michigan last week after John Beilein left the Wolverines to go coach the NBA's Cleveland Cavaliers. He'll be on campus from June 3rd through the 5th. That's 3 days. The last time Carolina had transfer